Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first pay my respects to the memory of Dr. V.C. Harris, who was my senior as well as a very dear friend, with whom times spent with whom were never uninteresting, because Harris had the curious ability of coming up with ideas, observations which were quite out of the ordinary, sometimes surprising and sometimes shocking us, but certainly most often creating ripples of new thought in us. Harris will be sorely missed, and probably the best respect to be paid to Harris is not merely to repeat his name, but to do the kind of work that Harris probably expected from himself and from others, which is basically speaking truth to power, which he did all through, and the benefits, the rewards, or the dangers of which he experienced throughout his life. So my respects to Harris. Secondly, I beg your forbearance. I'm not in the best of health. I have a pretty bad chest infection and I'm running a fever. So if in the process of making my presentation I happen to cough and do all kinds of strange stuff, please bear with me. If you want to support me, you can also cough and make it easier for me. That's one possibility. Now, one of the major crucial aspects of Enlightenment thought and of subsequent practices of modernity, not only in the Western world, but also in the colonized worlds, as well as in places where different forms of local modernity flourished. One major aspect has been the separation of the public and the private. In fact, it wouldn't be entirely wrong to say that the idea of the private, the idea of privacy, is essentially an offspring of modernity, where the question of the interior and the exterior, the personal and the non-personal or the public, the individual and the societal, were seen as connected but essentially separate, distinct categories with their own spaces, their own discourses, their own practices, and their own particular kinds of logic which cannot be reduced into the other. Or in other words, the notion of the individual which came up with the Enlightenment and which was based upon the idea of thinking of the I think, therefore I am, effectively asserted a sense of the individual which was not connected in a sense with society at large, an individual who doesn't draw his wherewithal, who doesn't actually assert his entity, his identity, from any kind of structures that are drawn from society, but in a fashion which is quite different from that, where society draws its identity from the individual. Now, in asserting that sense of individuality or that sense of the personal, what also happened at that point of time in opening up what one may call a continuous discourse, what we see at that point of historical time is also the inauguration of the sense of human rights, of the rights of the person, the rights of the individual. Of course, it has had a very long trajectory. It has had a long evolutionary process. But in retrospect, what we understand or realize as part of this entire discourse of human rights and the rights of the individual is a sense of an entity as a person who has a certain sense unto himself or herself, and who has the right to determine the self as well as the fate of the self without reference probably to the structures that are existing in society outside. I don't for even a moment deny the latent contradiction within that, but in fact, this particular mode of thinking about the individual, about the person, had tremendous effects upon the entire polity of societies, the way in which societies were structured, governance patterns were made possible, economies of governance were put in place, all of which came to be informed to a great extent by this. If I may just refer to something which probably most English students are quite aware of, and which in a way we realize as the first instance of the secularization of government, the case of Henry VIII, when he insisted on disaligning himself from the Roman Catholic Church, primarily because he wanted a divorce and he wanted to marry again, and because, in effect, the dictats of the Roman Catholic Church were so severe that such a divorce or remarriage was not possible. Now, even though Henry VIII was a monarch, was a king, the problem that guided, or the crisis that guided him into acting in the way he did, in actually disassociating the English Church from the Roman Catholic Church and establishing what came to be later known as the Anglican Church, was primarily a personal problem of having to get or having to beget a child, a male child, and for that reason wanting to divorce his earlier wife and take a new wife. Even while this is a question of monarchy, what we realize at that point is that a certain process was initiated there, as well as in the Protestant revolutions of larger Europe, where to a great extent the question of the state, the question of the power of the state, and the way in which the state is connected with religion, with faith, with the structures of religiosity in terms of the church, in terms of prayer mechanisms, etc., came to be divorced one from the other. This process of secularization we see, but at the same time, what we probably don't perceive in it is that particular move towards understanding faith, understanding religion as something that is quintessentially personal in nature, and one in which the state probably doesn't have any role to play. Now, if we look back upon that entire process, what actually becomes quite clear is that inscribed within that entire enterprise was an idea that there is a private domain that the individual occupies and a public domain within which the discourse of the state, the discourse of politics is expected to happen, and where these two domains are not expected to commingle, or where the public discourse is not expected to invade into the realm of the private. You probably are quite familiar with that old adage, the Englishman's home is his castle. The Englishman's home is his castle. Well, the French also have a very similar kind of idea. Similar kind of dictum too. What is implicit within those adages is the notion that the home, the private sphere, the private space that is occupied by the individual is sacrosanct, is something that is inviolable, something into which the public structures of governance and the state cannot enter into, and where the rights of the individual is supreme in one sense of the word. So, what we realize when we look at that entire process is that the idea of privacy, the idea of private property, the idea of a private domain, the idea of an interior life, the idea of an individual's rights as expressed in terms of his different activities, in terms of his different expressions, came to be understood as one particular realm which is not to be violated, entered into by the discourse of the state or of governance. Now, of course, you may ask, there were certainly several instances and continued instances of the state entering into the private sphere. What you find in the liberal democratic situation state is that the state had certain roles to play, and which was primarily in terms of the representativeness of its entire structure, in terms of the fact that the state is expected to represent the will and the wishes of the people. And if the state is to enter into the private space of a person, probably in terms of criminality, probably in terms of ensuring the security of society, etc., such an entry can be made only with adequate rationale being provided for it by the structures of legality. And which structures of legality are entirely accountable in the public sphere. What I'm trying to say is, suppose a person has committed a crime and he needs to be arrested from his home. And if he needs to be arrested from his home, the arrest can take place only on the basis of a very, very clear structure of evidence which is admissible in the structure of law, and which structure of law has to be presented in front of a public court so that the accountability, the structures of accountability are clearly there. What it means is that, what it effectively asserts is that private space, the private space which can be differently defined in terms of my thought processes that is inside me, my relationships in terms of my family, in terms of my personal links, etc., questions of my sexuality, questions of the ways in which I express myself, all of which are so connected with my body, with my mind, with my entity, my corporeality, are inviolable regions which can never be entered into by the state unless and until, and let me repeat that, unless and until this actually constitutes some kind of a threat to the very structure of that state itself in terms of criminality, in terms of some ways in which it poses a danger, in which case the state is required to actually enter into a kind of action which is based upon the structures of accountability in a public space. Now, this particular system, what we see in this particular system, where we see two major aspects here. One is that questions of religion, questions of faith came to be relegated primarily to the private sphere, and the state was not expected to actually intervene in that. The instance of Henry VIII, as I told you, the Protestant revolutions that we see, and the formation of most of the contemporary modern nation states, starting with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, both of which were at one and the same time not only national or nationalist struggles, but primarily struggles for individual freedom, for struggles for the establishment of the rights of the individual. The French Revolution was probably the first revolution, the first assertion of human rights in that particular sense. So these were at one and the same time, on the one hand, it was national struggle, nationalist struggles, attempts at establishing a modern nation, a modern state, which did not have reference to any of the earlier legitimation devices that were so persistent with earlier monarchies, such as church, faith, tradition, lineage, etc., or heritage, but which were primarily in terms of the will and the wishes of the people. And on the other hand, the establishment of structures, of discourses, of patterns of human rights, which were primarily to do with the individual and the person. What is interesting in this particular process is that while questions of faith came to be associated very clearly with the individual, imperceptibly enough, there was another aspect of life which also came to be associated with individual life, which till that point of time was not really associated with individual life, but more with the life of the state or with the life or the practices of governance. and that is the practice of the beautiful, the practice of beauty. If we were to look at the pre-Enlightenment, pre-modern structures of artistic practice, it becomes very clear that artistic practice was never individual practice in that sense. Artistic practice was collective practice to a great extent, but more than that, artistic practice always was connected with the structures of power. You have, he mentioned Greek art or Greek society. Look at the great Greek architectural marvels that were made. Look at the great Greek statues that were made, the brilliant sculptures that were made. In fact, till the Renaissance or till the 16th century, practically all art was entirely with the support of people in power, the monarchs, the aristocrats, the counts, the dukes, etc., or on another level through the support of the church. There wouldn't have been a Michelangelo had there been no Christian church. There wouldn't have been any of the Renaissance paintings, the pre-Renaissance paintings, or the medieval paintings of Italy without the support and the patronage of the church. And let me also say, along with the support, without the curtailment of the church. The church decided, the state decided what was to be drawn. The state decided what was to be expressed. And the artist's responsibility in terms of working within that patronage, within that confines or within that structure of aesthetic practice was one in which he was primarily or she was primarily an employee of the state commissioned to actually produce artworks, works of art, which was in terms of the likings of the state. In a certain sense, I mean, this is something that you find even in other parts of the world, even in Kerala or even in India. Look at the art forms that came up, look at the dance forms that came up, Kathakali or Bharatanatyam or Mohiniyattam. They were all primarily practices which were associated, courtly practices, associated with the centers of power, and where the question of taste or sensibility was primarily being determined by the powers that be. But what happened with the Renaissance and with the idea of the establishment of an individual with an interior working and whose practice or whose expression, whether artistic or otherwise, was seen not merely in terms of the structures of patronage or not merely in terms of the imprimaturs of, say, the church or the state, expression became a right. We have to understand this. There was no notion of the freedom of expression prior to modernity. The idea and the freedom of expression or the right of expression, that very category of human right, is possible only when the notion of artistry is actually reduced to the question of what you say, the individual artist. This is a question that I usually ask my students: who made the Taj Mahal? Come on, come up with the immediate answer, simple answer: Shah Jahan. Bloody Shah Jahan didn't have anything to do with the Taj Mahal. Okay, he paid for it, and then the sculptor, the master sculptor, if the legend actually is true, the master sculptor had to pay for it with his thumb because he didn't want another Taj Mahal to be made in another place. So what we find in that entire peroration itself is that the idea of an artwork, of an aesthetic work, was firmly connected with the notion of power. Shah Jahan is not a person. When we say Shah Jahan built or Shah Jahan made the Taj Mahal, what we are trying to say, or what we are effectively saying, is that that structure of monarchy, that structure of power, that particular structure of the state was causative for the creation of Taj Mahal. It is the question of whether that sculptor or that entire set of sculptors and artists really wanted to build Taj Mahal is not a question that is historically correct at that point of time. Mathura Meenakshi temple, Padmanabha temple, none of them were made by the artists because they were not expressions of the artists themselves, but the expressions of the might and the power and the extent of the state at those points of time. What we find subsequent to that is, of course, that beauty came to be a practice, an individual practice, a practice primarily seen in terms of the expression of the individual, in terms of his right to express himself, what is seen as his own interior life being expressed in a particular form, which makes it possible to be received not by the state but by other individuals. The practice of beauty, the practice of aesthetics came to be an individual practice, conducted, orchestrated, and staged or performed in individual personal spaces to be received by individual persons who determined the taste, determined the sensibility of an age, not by reference to the political authority outside, but by reference to their own sense of what is right, what is true, what is beautiful, etc. Now, with this preamble, let me come to the real grist, the real issue at stake here. Even when the nation, in that sense, actually differentiated between the private and the public, and when there were structures in place, structures of legality, structures of governance, which made it necessary for the private to be disassociated from the public, how far was this really true of the nation state in terms of its practice and in actual terms of its conceptualization itself is a question that we need to ask. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, even when the nation purports itself, the liberal nation, or the nations as they have become established from the 17th, 18th century onwards, these nations, even when they claim to be secular on the one hand, even when they claim to be public discourses, public practices, where the private domain or the private sphere is left unviolated, how far is the conceptualization of the nation or the establishment of nation states themselves, how far is this true is a question that we really need to ask. And for that, there are two things that we probably need to look at. And the first answer to that would be what Ernest Gellner comes up with, his dictum that nationalisms and states are not, nationalism is not the product of states and nations, but that states and nations are the product of nationalism. What do we mean by this? It is not as if a nation or a state comes into form, comes into being, and then there is nationalism that actually is a product of that nation. But on the other hand, it is a sense of nationalism, it's an ideology of nationalism, the thinking and imaginative process of nationalism that actually creates nations and the states which are associated with that. And in continuance of that, with every shift in the tone, in the quality, in the color of nationalism, there will be a shift in the nature of the nation and the nature of the state. Even when we say, to put it very simply, even when we say that the Indian state has been there from 1947, don't we know beyond anything else that the state that we are under right now is not the same state as what it was during the Nehruvian dispensation. It is a different state, it's a different nation. This change, this transformation, this shift is primarily because, as Ernest Gellner clearly puts it, the nation is a product, the state is a product of nationalism. How does this nationalism come to be? Or how does nationalism construct nations? Because ultimately, as all human products are, the nation is also an artificial construct. The nation is not something natural, even when there are claims of naturalness which refers to antecedents which are thousands of years back. Such mythic histories are being constructed. The fact remains that nations are ultimately artificial. They are man-made constructions, and man-made constructions which are clearly inscribed by the concerns of each present within which the nation is actually constructed. So in that sense, what are the processes through which nationalism actually aids, or the processes through which nationalism itself is manufactured, and how nationalism helps or aids in the creation of nations is a primary question. And for that, I shall refer to two theorists. One is Emil Durkheim, and the other is Benedict Anderson, to look at how nationalism functions. You're also free to drink water. Yeah. Okay. Emil Durkheim, in his phenomenal work, that's the only way to describe it, the elementary forms of religious life, made a sociological analysis of pre-modern, pre-industrial societies and looked at how such societies came to be comprehensive entities which connected one to the other, or within which there was a sense of belonging made among the members of such societies. According to him, rituals and performances of the community were the primary media with which or by which such sense of belonging, such sense of community, such sense of a society is actually created. When he talks about rituals and performances, he's of course in a pre-modern context talking of agricultural rituals, rituals of faith, rituals of religion, rituals of the passage rites as we see from one stage to another in each point of a person's life, say the samskaram, the different forms, the ritual of what you call anointment, the ritual of entering into adulthood, the ritual of marriage, the ritual of birth and entry of a new person into the society, etc. All these rituals, according to him, were primarily collective in nature and where the members of a society engaged in practices in a collective fashion whereby in a performative mode they internalized the meanings of that society, the sense of that society, the priorities and values of that society, and by virtue of which internalization they effectively became members of that society. He also speaks of those great, huge rituals where in connection with them, the people, the participants of the ritual effectively experienced a collective effervescence. Think of this, it's a very simple kind of formulation. If we are part of this huge ritual of singing all together, the singing of a single person is one thing, the singing of 2 people, singing of 3 people, but the singing of 100 people together, even when it is one person singing, multiplied by 100, there is something extra that comes up there, a surplus that comes up there. There is a kind of infectious joy, a kind of infectious feeling, an emotional high that is experienced by the participants of that. What actually Emil Durkheim suggests is that this collective effervescence, this feeling of belongingness that one has, is a modus operandi whereby that particular community creates a sense of belonging, a sense of connection in each participant, while at the same time imparting to them a sense of what the values of that society are, what the rights of that society are, what is the truth conception of that society is, everything in one sense by which an individual in a society would structure his life with. This is one side. And if we look at that, what is interesting about Emil Durkheim's analysis of pre-modern societies is that he also suggests in no ambiguous terms that this particular prognostication, this particular analysis is equally applicable not only to pre-modern societies but to modern societies themselves. That in fact, even in post-industrial or industrial societies, even in secular societies, what we see are actually these kind of collective rituals which create or which actually generate a sense of belongingness in the people. Think of the National Independence Day celebration, which we either watch through the TV or we are actually present there. The spectacle of this huge arms, the military, the flag, the Prime Minister, the President arriving, the entire regalia connected with the nation, all of this where as spectators we are part of it, sometimes not as spectators, as participants you may be part of it. What is actually done there is to create a sense of the nation. The nation, a sense of the nation, an imaginary of the nation is constructed in the minds of the people who are actually participating in that. But further than that, what Emil Durkheim's analysis offered to sociologists later, especially in the post-war era, and quite recently, especially in the context of American nationalism, and later on in the context of Eastern European xenophobic nationalism, is a certain kind of yardstick with which, even in modern contemporary societies, nationhood is actually constructed. Great, brilliant work by Marvin Carlson and David Ingle on American nationalism, totem signs, symbols. One second. Sometimes my memory fails me. Blood Sacrifice and the Nation by Carolyn Marvin and David Ingle, which is a study of American nationalism. What they actually suggest is that American nationalism is a civil religion, is a civic religion, and it partakes of all the iconography, all the ritual practices of religions in general, where the worship is not of a god, but of the nation itself. And the flag becomes the totem symbol of that particular community, and the idea of the individual becoming subservient to the nation in a worshipful fashion, just as in an earlier time, in a pre-modern situation, the individual would prostrate himself in front of God, in front of the divine entity. Here the individual prostrates himself in front of the nation in terms of the flag, and sacrifices his life, bloodletting, so to speak, sacrifices his life for the sake of the nation, for the values of patriotism, through such modes as war or invasions, where through that sacrifice, this idea of the nation is created in the people who are actually part of the sacrifice, not as sacrificial animals themselves, but as witnesses to that sacrifice. Ladies and gentlemen, you always probably wonder why it is that political organizations need martyrs. It is the same kind of philosophy that works there too. Because martyrdom is necessary in creating bloodletting. You need to have a blood sacrifice in order to create a sense of belonging. Someone has sacrificed himself. This idea of sacrifice, as Lefebvre actually says, sacrifice is the mode by which something is institutionalized. Something comes into being. You sacrifice yourself for the nation. You sacrifice yourself for love. You sacrifice yourself for a political organization. And it is that sacrifice which actually gives body, gives essence to the idea itself, giving it some kind of a materiality, so to speak, even while it is primarily imaginary in nature. What sociologists have actually come up with, based on Emile Durkheim's analysis, is that contemporary nations, even while being postmodern sometimes, even while being industrial, or even in the digital age, seem to partake of the same kind of practices, not the same, but the same kind of practices as pre-modern societies did in actually creating a sense of the nation through such gigantic, through such huge mammoth rituals, which forcibly appropriate the minds of the people into a sense of nationalism, into a sense of patriotism. That is the one side of it. But the second theorist, which is Benedict Anderson in his Imagined Communities, which is a text which probably most of you are quite familiar with, where he said that a nation is primarily an imagined feature. It is not something that is real, it is not something that is natural, it is not something that is given, but it is an imagined thing. He refers to the British nation, and he asks, how is it that Britain actually became a nation? Because Britain is a cauldron of different races, of different languages, of different kinds of people. The Angles, okay, the original Celts, the Bog people, then the Celts, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Normans, the Danes, the other Scandinavians, the Romans, then the blacks, then the browns. All these people from various sources, from various stock, they're all together. And as he says, in furious lust begot the new Englishman, and who was considered to be the pure Englishman. What kind of purity is there? The purity itself is imagined. Now, every notion of purity is imagined. whether it be British or otherwise, such notions of purity are always vexed ideas, and the notion of purity is itself primarily ideological in nature. But when Britain is imagined as a nation, as a community, as a comprehensive community with a sense of belonging between or among all its participants, the major mode for that are cultural expressions. For example, British literature or English literature as an institution came to the fore, came to be introduced in the universities primarily as a mode whereby in a situation where religion is no longer a viable force, literature came to be the force whereby people could be held together. Shakespeare came to be the quintessence of Britishness, and the entire canon of British literature came to be the expression of the greatness of the British nation itself in retrospect. But one thing that Benedict Anderson actually indicates, and which is very crucial, is that quite different from what Emil Durkheim suggests, Benedict Anderson suggests that nations, even as they are constructed with these great rituals, they are also constructed through very, very minute, very, very private, very, very everyday habitual activities. He refers to the newspaper, the reading of newspapers. In a brilliant passage, he refers to the reading of newspapers and says, I read a newspaper in the morning. And when I read the newspaper, it is a very private activity, isn't it? I'm reading it just by myself. But even as I'm reading it, I'm quite aware of the fact that there are thousands of other people reading the same news as I am at that point of time. And when I start off in the day, and when I meet other people, my natural assumption, natural in inverted commas, natural assumption is that if I were to meet Jijo at 10 o'clock, my assumption is that he knows what I know. Why? Because he has read a newspaper, probably the same newspaper as I've read, or probably another newspaper that probably has the same kind of news in there. This sharing, in one sense, of an everyday activity, of a certain structure of knowledge, a certain structure of activity amongst people who are not even known to each other. Actually, he makes a very interesting remark there where he says, it is performed, such activities are performed in silent privacy, in the layer of the skull. Yet each communicant is well aware that the ceremony he performs is being replicated simultaneously by thousands of others, of whose existence he is confident, yet of whose identity he has not the slightest notion. Who else is reading it? I don't know. Someone in Punjab, someone in Bihar, someone in Malappuram, people I don't know. But there is something that connects all of us together by this one simple activity. What Anderson is actually trying to suggest here, or the implications of Anderson's analysis, is that this imaginary which actually creates this community among all these disparate people who do not know one another is actually a very private kind of enterprise, a private activity, but which private activity actually leads to the creation of the sense of the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you've caught the implication of what I'm trying to say. I started off by saying that Enlightenment thought and modernity actually instituted a serious schism between the public and the private, a separation of the public domain and the private domain, and that the modern nation, as a product of that Enlightenment thought and of modernity, clearly instituted in its practices this division between the public and the private, whereby that which is religious, that which is sacred, that which is to do with faith, that which is to do with beautiful, was assigned to the private realm. But within the nation itself, what is curiously interesting and very crucial is that within the nation itself, the construction of the nation is made possible not merely solely by public discourses or public practices, but by practices which are essentially private in nature. The nation, even while it purports to be a public discourse, even while it purports to be a public affair, it is also at one and the same time, simultaneously, an equally private, an equally personal thing which enters into the private domains of people, probably clandestinely, probably unconsciously, nevertheless quite strongly at the same time. Now, within the structures of democracy, liberal democracy especially, and the structures of parliamentary systems world over, such invasions into the private realm is actually curtailed, held in check, obstructed by the structures of law, by the structures of representative government, by the questions of accountability on a public level. But when we come to another kind of dispensation, which is where we come to the question of fascism, such curtailments are not possible at all. And what is the reason behind that? Roger Griffin, the British sociologist, it's not entirely possible to describe these people as merely sociologists. I mean, they inhabit a number of spaces at the same time. Roger Griffin is a political theorist as well as a sociologist who coined the phrase palingenetic ultranationalism. Looking at especially Nazi nationalism in Germany, and to some extent the Italian modes of fascism, as well as the Spanish forms of nationalism during Franco's reign, and subsequently the rise of different forms of intense nationalism in Eastern Europe, in Turkey, in other parts of the world. What he actually suggested was that there is a particular turn of nationalism, a particular idiom of nationalism, which can only be called as palingenetic ultranationalism. Palingenetic means palin, again, genetic, rebirth. Genetic is birth, palin is again. So, birth again, rebirth. Such nationalisms always predicate themselves upon the assumption that they are reviving an earlier nation, an ancient nation, a nation which has been there but which probably got demolished, which probably got destroyed, and which through their efforts are being born again. A Hindu nation, for example, an Islamic nation which existed much before, a Christian nation that was there, an Aryan nation which was much before there, but then which came to be overrun by Christianity and the structures of modernity, which had to be revived. This idea of rebirth, of revival, of bringing to the fore something that existed before, a kind of mythic imagination that inspires such palingenetic ultranationalisms, what is important about them, as Roger Griffin clearly points out, is that unlike in the other forms of liberal democratic nations, where there is a clear structure of accountability to the people at large, in these cases, the accountability, the responsibility, the obligation is not to the people, but to this ideology of a nation, the ideology of a community, the ideology of revival of something that existed before. Needless to say, as Hobsbawm very clearly says, every tradition is invented. There is no tradition that is not invented. Every tradition is invented. The idea that we have a tradition, we talk of Kerala here all the time, when we have those curious moments like Onam, etc., all of a sudden people start wearing, the Kerala saris and the Kerala dress and all that. And we think this is what Keralites used to wear all the time from time immemorial. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to be the bringer of bad news. That's hardly the case. Kerala didn't have a sari till 1930s. There are two kinds of production that actually indicates Kerala's movement into industrialization, and that is one is the tile factories, oottu companigalille, tile factories, and the other is the weaving companies. And these before the weaving companies, what we had was plain, unadorned kind of white cloth, both for the lower body as well as the upper body. And it is only in the 1930s or the 1940s that imported from Tamil Nadu. It is very interesting. These patterns were imported from Tamil Nadu. മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയാനല്ല, കസവിൻ്റെ ഈ ഒരു സംഗതി ഉണ്ടല്ലോ, അത് കാഞ്ചീപുരം മുതലായിട്ടുള്ള ദിക്കിൽ നിന്നും അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു രൂപമാതൃക എടുത്തിട്ട് അത് പ്രകാരം ഒരു ഈ മുണ്ടും രണ്ടാമുണ്ടും സാരി ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന ഒരു സമ്പ്രദായം തുടങ്ങുക ചെയ്തത്. അതാണ് ഇപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് കേരളീയം ആയിട്ട് മാറിയിട്ടുള്ളത്. അതൊരു കൺസ്ട്രക്റ്റഡ് ട്രഡീഷനായി നമ്മളൊക്കെ അത് പൂർണ്ണമായി അംഗീകരിക്കുകയും ചെയ്യും. എന്നിട്ട് അതിനെതിരെയുള്ള, അത് ഭയങ്കര രസകരമായ കാര്യം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്, അതിൻ്റെ എതിരെയുള്ള വിമർശനത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഭാഗം ഇത് സവർണമാണെന്ന്. ഇത് സവർണമേ അല്ല, ഇത് സവർണതയും അവർണവും എന്നല്ല, ഇത് പ്യുവർലി കമേഴ്ഷ്യൽ കൺസ്ട്രക്റ്റാണ്, പ്യുവർലി കമേഴ്ഷ്യൽ ആയിട്ടുള്ള സാധനം. പക്ഷേ അത് സവർണ അപ്രോപ്രിയേഷൻ ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുണ്ടോ എന്നുള്ള ചോദ്യം വളരെ ഗൗരവമായിട്ട് നിൽക്കുന്നു. പക്ഷേ ദ ട്രഡീഷൻ ഇസ് ഇറ്റ് സെൽഫ്. ദിസ് ഇസ് ദ സെയിം തിങ് വിത്ത് ദ സ്കോട്ടിഷ് ക്വിൽറ്റ്. The Scottish quilt did not exist before the 19th century. The Scottish quilt came into being primarily as a constructed thing, as something that would distinguish the Scottish regalia from the English or from the Irish. So what I'm trying to say is all traditions are primarily invented. And this nation, especially in the palingenetic system, is a mythic nation, is a nation that does not need to exist, in fact does not exist at all, has not existed at all, but is constructed as something that has existed in retrospective rationalization, whereby that which is considered to be essential now, or that which is considered to be aspirational now, is attributed to the past as something that existed during that time. But what is crucial here, and this is the politics of the whole issue, and what is crucial here is that in such a dispensation, and I shall not differentiate between different forms of palingenetic ultranationalism, whether it is Christian or Hindu or Islam or Aryan, in all of them, in different ways, probably to different degrees, their primary accountability is not to the accountability structures of the modern nation, but their accountability is to this ideology. What happens in such a case is that the implicit possibility of privacy invasion, the implicit possibilities within the construction of the nation itself, within the imaginary of the nation itself, where the divide between the public and the private can be overridden, or where the nation is imagined primarily through the private discourse, is exploited to its maximum potential. What we see around us today, in India especially, in terms of the Hindutva phenomenon, is precisely a nation where the public-private divide is completely destroyed, is completely taken away, and where the public discourse enters into the private, the public sphere invades the private sphere in such a fashion, not only in terms of the fear being created within the populace, but also in this twin fashions of one, how faith and the sacred is brought into the private sphere, and how structures of beauty are brought into the private sphere by the state themselves. Look at some of the practices that we have here. The singing of the national anthem, for instance. The national anthem, ultimately speaking, is a song. Okay, adoru paattana. It's a song. And as a song, the singing of a song is primarily an aesthetic activity, as any songs go. But this song has a different implication altogether, in the sense that it is associated as a totem, it is associated as a symbol of a particular nation. And something which used to be employed at certain ceremonial points of time, at certain high points of the nation's performance itself, has now entered into the most private spheres, spaces of people, where you go to watch a film. Where, I mean, I saw this video which was unbelievable, I mean, which was really a strange video, where a person walks through the streets of Bombay with one of those microphones in his hand. You probably have seen that. And he puts a stool right in the middle of the road and then places this there, and the national anthem starts blaring. And people are walking by, they're caught in two minds. There's a lady who's walking with a huge set of shopping bags in her hand. She doesn't know whether to stop and stand there or whether to walk. Some people walk, take 2 steps and then stop. Some people stop and stand at attention. Some people ignore it, but majority are taken aback and have no idea what to do. And then they decide it's better to stand. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a way in which what is essentially an aesthetic practice enters into the most private, this lady who's walking with the shopping bags in her hand, she is engaged in a primarily private activity. She has bought food, she has bought provisions for a house, and she is actually moving from the supermarket or the shop to a house. She's walking on that way where she has no other business but to get this particular set of articles back to her home. She is caught midway and she is made to stop there, and she is made to stand at attention, because what is being demanded from her at that point of time, which is purely a private time, is her allegiance to the nation, her patriotism, a statement of her patriotism, a statement of her nationalism, where in an aesthetic manner what we find is that the structure of the nation, or the discourse of the nation, which is essentially a public discourse and which should be assigned to the specific public spaces in which the nation should actually articulate itself, is here forcibly made to enter the experience, the private experience domains of people. Now, if you look at this, we find the same pattern being repeated everywhere in a number of similar discourses. Swachh Bharat, for instance. It's probably a very interesting thing. Yes, it's a very nice thing for people to be clean and for the surroundings to be clean. But when the state takes it as a value-ridden activity, where cleanliness ceases to be something to do with hygiene, something to do with your personal self or with the community self, but becomes a national value, that cleanliness attains not merely a question of health or hygiene. Yoga, again, the performance of yoga, which probably with a stretch of imagination can be regarded as something that may help your physical health, is here presented as not something to do with health at all, but it is an aesthetic activity where you have 100 or 200 people with pot-bellied politicians with 56 inches, whatever, standing there and going through these contortions. And I mean, the best thing about it is that it is sometimes hilarious, but that's hardly the intention. That's the whole point. That's hardly the intention. The intention is to create the sense of a certain pattern where you are demanded, you are required to actually follow this practice as an aesthetic practice, where the state takes upon itself, validates itself, its practices themselves as what a notion of beauty is actually created there. I don't have any visuals, and the reason behind it is that I don't need any visuals. You can actually imagine this. Think of those long serpentine lines and queues that happened a year back, when all and sundry, male and female, employed and unemployed, were all demanded, required to stand in line, to change their notes, to get new notes. You have seen those photographs, these long serpentine queues, kilometers long. We are standing in the rain, standing in the sun. Some people, swoon. Some people lose consciousness. Some are taken to hospitals. Some lose their mind and start screaming. All kinds of strange things. For what? For the sake of the nation. You're sacrificing yourself. You're sacrificing your health. You're sacrificing your time. All for a better good. All for a better economy, so that corruption can be rooted out. Never ask the question whether corruption really gets rooted out or not, but the real issue is this. It is a moment, it is a historic moment where the entire populace is required to state by their very action, with their bodies, with their minds, with their presence out in the open, that they have allegiance to the nation. This is where the entire refrain of the nation wants to know that the nation is something that is present throughout in your lives, not only in your waking moments in the public, but also your sleeping moments, your private moments, your moments when I have this great, brilliant, possibility that I think shall come up someday, that the national anthem shall be broadcasted 12:30 at night to be played at every home, especially in the bedrooms. That would be a great thing to happen, where God alone knows in what state each of these people would be. People would have to set up their alarms and get up at 12 o'clock so that they can stand at attention. Where this is something that is very curious or strange as it may sound. Ladies and gentlemen, don't assume that this is not possible. These are possible. These things are possible. Probably 10 or 15 years back, you wouldn't have believed that we would have stood in queues like this just so that we can change a 100 rupee note or a 200 rupee, 500 rupee note. But we did. We actually did, is a fact. Now, moving away from such specific examples, what actually seems to be happening here is that even while we can take recourse to earlier structures or pre-modern structures where questions of ethics, of sacredness, of religion and faith on the one hand, and questions of beauty, sensibilities, taste, etc., where the prerogatives of the state or the structures of power, this seems to be somewhat similar to it. But here, the difference is that the legitimation itself comes from a particular ideology of power which refers to an earlier form of the nation and which has no accountability whatsoever to what one would call the liberal or the democratic structures of nationhood in the contemporary world. In other words, what we have here in this creation is strangely indeed what Schiller once called the aesthetic state on the one hand, or a theocratic state on the other hand, both of which, ladies and gentlemen, ultimately speaking, is completely inimical to any sense of individual freedom, to any sense of democracy whatsoever. I shall not continue. Thank you very much.